Ivan Warren carried an aura that silenced rooms. As the head of Warren Global, his very presence was enough to make seasoned executives falter. His fury was infamous, his standards unreachable, and his tolerance razor-thin. Anyone who fell short of his expectations was dismantled without hesitation, whether through sharp words or ruthless actions. For Ivan, this wasn't just a temperamental flaw. It was a shield forged in a childhood steeped in pain and neglect. Ivan's upbringing was chaos, wrapped in discipline. His father, a domineering businessman, believed compassion was weakness. His mother, timid and broken by years of silence, offered no protection. Whenever young Ivan dared to reveal fear or gentleness, his father crushed it out of him. "The world devours the weak, Ivan," he would sneer. Those words burned into his bones. From then on, Ivan resolved never to kneel, never to be prey. Power became his obsession, rage his sharpest tool. In the corporate world, it earned him empires. But in private life, it left him hollow. Mercy, tenderness, love. These were languages Ivan never learned to speak, and then Ruby Johnson walked into his orbit. After a public meltdown that made headlines, Ivan Warren's empire began to crack. Protesters accused him of gutting neighborhoods, snapping up distressed properties, driving out mom-and-pop shops, and replacing them with gleaming towers and high-end boutiques. At a heated community forum, Ivan collapsed mid-speech, rushed to the hospital after his blood pressure spiked to a dangerous level. The board of Warren Global had reached its limit. They forced him to take a leave of absence, declaring him unfit to lead until he recovered. Ivan, however, was not a man accustomed to surrender. He tore through nurses one after another, determined to prove he was untouchable. Most didn't last a week until Ruby Johnson arrived. Ruby was different. She didn't scare easily, not after the life she had lived. The eldest of 5, in a neighborhood that demanded toughness, Ruby had been more parent than sister. With her mother working double shifts and her father bouncing in and out of prison, she raised her siblings with grit and sharp resolve. Fear had no place in her vocabulary. The first time Ivan roared at her, Ruby didn't flinch. "Try me," she said coolly. "You're stuck with me, and I don't scare easy," Ivan scoffed, but beneath the sneer, something unsettled him. Ruby didn't tremble. She didn't bow. She treated him less like a powerful CEO and more like an angry child, overdue for a lesson in humility. When he tested her, she crossed her arms, tapped her foot, or rested a hand on her hip, waiting him out like a storm she knew would eventually pass. For the first time in his life, Ivan found himself at war with someone who couldn't be conquered. He paced the floor, restless, unable to shake her from his mind. He tried threats, volume, intimidation, but Ruby only rolled her eyes, a quiet warning in her steady gaze. "Keep this up," she told him once, "and you'll destroy yourself." One evening, after another tirade, she delivered a blow sharper than any boardroom rival had ever managed. "Like father, like son," Ivan hissed through clenched teeth. "What do you know about my father?" Ruby only smiled, turned, and walked out the door. That night, sleep eluded him. Memories clawed their way back. The ruthless father who demanded perfection, the fragile mother who offered no defense. He paced until dawn, haunted by a past he'd buried under steel and fury. Days later, his body betrayed him once more. This time it wasn't exhaustion. It was a stroke. The stroke stripped Ivan Warren of the one thing he prized most: control. Half his body betrayed him, his speech faltered, and for the first time since he was a boy, he felt small, vulnerable, weak. He despised it. When he woke to find Ruby Johnson standing at his bedside, arms crossed and expression unreadable, his fury burned hotter than the weakness in his body. "Leave," he rasped. The word came out broken, slurred, but still full of venom. Ruby didn't move. No, the defiance rattled him. Everyone else, doctors, nurses, even his own board members, tiptoed around him. They spoke in hushed tones, terrified of his wrath. But Ruby? She met him head-on, unflinching, as though she saw through the storm to the boy who had once been broken. Ivan lashed out whenever he could. Sarcasm, glares, gritted commands, but Ruby refused to bend. If he tried to throw her out, she dragged the chair closer. If he hurled insults, she simply raised a brow and asked if he was finished. "You hate me, don't you?" He growled one evening, his voice thick from the strain of therapy. Ruby shook her head. "I don't hate you. I just don't pity you." That's the difference. Her words burrowed under his skin, refusing to leave. He wanted to despise her for them, to file her away as another adversary. But when the long nights came, when the silence pressed in, and memories of his father's voice echoed in his head, it was Ruby's presence that steadied him. He fought her every step. He mocked the exercises she insisted he do, refused the meals she brought, even threw a glass once, in a fit of rage. She only sighed, cleaned it up, and set another glass down. "You can fight me all you want," she said, her voice low, unwavering. "But I'm not leaving, so either get used to me or waste your breath trying to push me away." Ivan hated her for being right. He hated that when he finally fell asleep, it was the sound of her steady footsteps in the hallway that gave him peace. He hated that her strength made his own emptiness impossible to ignore, and most of all, he hated that a part of him, buried deep, stubborn, aching, was beginning to wonder if Ruby Johnson was the only person who had ever truly seen him. Ivan Warren was a man who refused to be caged, even by his own failing body. The moment he regained partial strength in his left side, he demanded his phone, his laptop, his schedules. Against medical orders, he tried to run meetings from his hospital bed, barking through slurred words and heavy breaths. When the doctors urged patience, he snarled. When therapists begged him to slow down, he threw them out. And when Ruby Johnson told him to stop, he laughed in her face. "You think I'm going to sit here and rot?" He spat, dragging himself from the bed one morning, sweat beading across his brow. His legs buckled, but he clutched the nightstand, trembling with rage. "I built an empire with these hands. No stroke, no nurse, no you is going to keep me down." Ruby moved toward him, but he shoved her help away, collapsing back onto the mattress in a heap of stubborn pride. His chest heaved, and for a fleeting second she thought he might pass out again. "Pathetic," she muttered. His head snapped toward her. "What did you say?" Ruby's eyes didn't waver. "You're so terrified of looking weak that you're killing yourself to prove you're strong. And for what? So the board can pat you on the head while they steal your company out from under you? So you can die proving a point no one cares about?" Her words were sharp enough to cut through the fog of his anger, but she wasn't done. She leaned forward, her voice low, each word a hammer blow. "You've turned into the man you swore you'd never be. Just like your father, driven, cruel, empty. You think you're proving him wrong? No, you're living his life all over again." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Ivan froze, his pulse thundering in his ears. Images of his father flashed unbidden. The sneer, the iron fists, the endless refrain of weak men get eaten alive. He wanted to deny it, to roar back at her, but his throat tightened instead. For the first time, silence clamped his tongue. Ruby straightened, her expression softening just enough to twist the knife. "The difference is you still have a choice, but not for long." She left him with those words, her footsteps echoing down the hall. He even sat in the empty room, shaking, his hands curled into fists. He had never felt smaller, never felt more seen, and he hated it. That night, Ruby's words refused to leave him, just like your father. They looped in his mind, louder than the monitors beeping at his bedside, sharper than the ache in his chest. He saw his father's face every time he closed his eyes, the cold sneer, the way he broke people down until they were nothing. The way he had broken Ivan Divan, had built his life on the promise he would never be that man. Yet here he was, raging, cruel, driving people away until all that remained was silence. He tried to push the thought aside, pacing his room with a slow, dragging limp, but the truth pressed harder with every step. Ruby was right. He had spent decades proving he didn't need anyone, and in the end, he had become a mirror of the monster he despised. Somewhere around dawn, his body gave out again. He sank into the chair by the window, his chest heaving, sweat soaking through his shirt. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, gaunt, furious, exhausted. And for the first time, he couldn't summon the old armor. He broke. The tears came without warning, hot and unrelenting. He buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking with years of grief he had buried under anger. Memories clawed up, his father's voice, his mother's silence, the emptiness of all the victories he had thought would make it worth it. When Ruby found him like that, she didn't speak. She didn't mock or scold. She simply pulled a chair beside him and sat, silent, steady, her presence grounding him in a way he didn't know how to explain. At first, Ivan turned away, ashamed, but Ruby didn't leave, and slowly something inside him shifted. He realized she wasn't there because she had to be. She was there because she chose to be. That choice pierced through the loneliness he had carried his whole life. He looked at her with red-rimmed eyes, his voice breaking on the words, "I don't know how." Ruby tilted her head, her gaze firm but gentle. "Then start small. Stop fighting me. That's enough for now." It wasn't surrender. Not fully. But for Ivan Warren, the man who had made a career out of never bowing, it was the first step towards something he'd never dared to believe he could have. Healing. Ruby never coddled him. That was the first thing Ivan noticed. Where others rushed to smooth his path, Ruby placed obstacles in it. Not out of cruelty, but because she believed he could face them. When he muttered that a task was pointless, she folded her arms and waited until he tried. When he snarled that he didn't need help, she reminded him, needing help isn't weakness. Staying broken is. At first, Ivan resisted. He failed exercises on purpose, scoffed at her encouragement, barked whenever she corrected him. But Ruby didn't rise to the bait. She let him rage, then calmly set the next challenge in front of him. He hated her persistence, and yet, when his body finally obeyed after weeks of stubborn practice, it was her quiet nod of approval that struck deeper than any boardroom applause had ever done. Little by little, she redefined strength in ways he had never considered. Strength, she showed him, wasn't shouting louder than everyone else. It was taking the slow, painful steps back to walking across the room. It wasn't tearing down those who failed him, but learning to sit in silence with his own failures without crumbling. It wasn't crushing others to hold control. It was trusting someone enough to lean when his body faltered. One evening, after a grueling session, Ivan dropped heavily into the chair by his bed. His chest rose and fell, sweat glistening at his temples. Ruby handed him a glass of water without a word. He drank, staring at her, something unreadable stirring in his eyes. "You don't treat me like a patient," he said at last. Ruby gave a small shrug. "That's because you're not one. You're a man learning how to stand again. Big difference." The words landed heavier than she probably knew. Ivan turned them over long into the night. He realized then that Ruby wasn't just teaching him to move again. She was teaching him to be again. To see strength not as dominance, but as endurance. Not as armor, but as resilience. And though he'd never admit it out loud, even Warren, the man who once ruled by fear, was beginning to look forward to the mornings, not for the battle, but for the quiet possibility Ruby carried with her presence. Ivan Warren had never been good at silence. In his world, silence meant weakness, hesitation waiting to be devoured. But with Ruby Johnson, silence often lingered, heavy and unyielding. She didn't rush to fill the air, didn't scramble to appease him. She let the quiet work on him, and that unnerved him more than any shouting match. Weeks passed. His body grew stronger, though his pride lagged behind. He learned to walk further with the cane, to use his left hand without fumbling, to breathe through the pain rather than fight it. Each small victory should have fueled him, but the truth unsettled him. They weren't his victories alone. They were hers too, and he resented it. One afternoon, after Ruby caught him trying to hide the tremor in his hand, he snapped. "Do you enjoy this? Watching me stumble like a cripple? The great Ivan Warren, brought low, crawling under your watch." Ruby didn't blink. She set the papers she'd been holding on the table and leveled him with a look so sharp it cut deeper than his outburst. No, she said evenly. What I enjoy is watching you fight your way back when you're not too busy throwing tantrums. His jaw tightened. You talk to me like I'm a child. Sometimes you act like one. The retort stung because it was true. He turned away, muscles rigid. But the heat in his chest wasn't just anger. It was something he couldn't name, something dangerous. That night alone, her words replayed in his head, just as the memory of her steady gaze did. He couldn't escape it. He told himself it was irritation, nothing more. She was insufferable, infuriating, impossible. And yet, he found himself waiting for her footsteps in the morning, for the sound of her calm voice cutting through his storms. Ruby, for her part, kept her distance. Not physically, but emotionally. She was steady, professional, never giving more than necessary, and that only fueled his restlessness. For the first time in his life, Ivan didn't know how to command someone's loyalty, much less their care. Ruby gave neither freely, and it unsettled him more than he would admit. It wasn't romance yet, not even close, but something had shifted, a spark buried deep beneath the ashes of his pride. And no matter how hard he tried to smother it, Ruby Johnson was the one person he couldn't push away. It happened late one evening, when the day's therapy had wrung him dry. Ivan sat at the edge of his bed, shoulders slumped, cane leaning against the nightstand. The storm outside rattled the windows, but the storm inside him felt worse. Ruby was sorting through his medication schedule when he spoke without thinking, his voice low, almost lost beneath the rain. My father used to lock me in the study, he said. Ruby froze, her hand hovering over the pill tray. He hadn't looked at her, hadn't meant for the words to slip out. But now they were there, raw and jagged, and silence pressed hard against him. When I didn't meet his standards, Ivan continued, eyes fixed on the floor. Didn't speak right, didn't stand straight, didn't win. He let out a bitter laugh. He'd tell me I'd never be more than a disappointment. Sometimes he'd keep me there all night until I got it right. Ruby didn't interrupt. She simply set the pills down, her movements quiet, measured, giving him space he didn't know he needed. I told myself I'd prove him wrong, that I'd build something so big, so untouchable he'd choke on his words. Ivan's hand curled into a fist on his knee. But all I did was become him. The admission felt like glass tearing from his throat. He hadn't said those words aloud to anyone, not once in his life. And yet here he was, offering them to the one woman he swore he'd never give power over him. Finally, he glanced up, expecting pity in her eyes. But Ruby's gaze was steady, firm, without an ounce of condescension. You survived him, she said softly. That's not weakness, that's strength. And you're not your father, Ivan, unless you choose to be. Her words landed heavier than his father's fists ever had. For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain eased, leaving only the hum of the machines and the quiet thunder of his heart. Ivan turned away, swallowing hard. He hated how exposed he felt, how one slip had opened a door he'd bolted shut for decades. But another part of him, the part that still remembered being that boy in the study, felt something else, relief. And that unsettled him most of all. Ruby didn't press him that night. She let the silence stand, as if she knew he wasn't ready for more. But the next morning, when she found him pacing with his cane, she spoke gently, almost cautiously. You don't have to carry all of this alone, Ivan. He shot her a sharp look, bracing for pity. But her tone was even, steady, the way it always was. You've spent your whole life fighting ghosts, she continued. Your father's voice, your own anger, the weight of trying to prove yourself. But fighting alone hasn't made you free. It's made you sick. You need someone to help you untangle it. His eyes narrowed. You're talking about therapy, Ruby crossed her arms. Yes, and before you start roaring, hear me out. You've rebuilt your body piece by piece. Now it's time to rebuild what's in here. She tapped her temple. Otherwise, this cycle will never end. He scoffed, trying to brush her off. I don't sit in circles and cry to strangers. Ruby leaned in, lowering her voice, calm but firm. This isn't about crying. It's about breaking free. And you don't have to do it alone. Her eyes locked on his, unwavering. "I'll be there. Every session, if that's what it takes. But you have to agree to try." The room went still. Ivan gripped his cane, jaw tight, war raging inside him. Therapy meant vulnerability. It meant admitting he wasn't in control. Every instinct screamed against it. But the thought of Ruby sitting beside him, not as a nurse, not as an adversary, but as an anchor, shifted something in him. "Only if you're there," he said finally, voice rough, almost reluctant. "I'll agree. Only if you're there." Ruby's lips curved into the faintest smile. Then it settled. Within the week, a therapist began coming to Ivan's home 3 times a week. The first session was torture. Questions he didn't want to answer, memories he tried to bury. But Ruby sat next to him, steady and unflinching. When his temper flared, she grounded him with a single look. When silence threatened to suffocate him, her presence kept him from walking out. Little by little, Ivan found himself saying things he'd never thought he'd speak aloud. And though he still resented the process, he kept showing up for one reason only: because Ruby was there. The therapy sessions were grueling. At first, Ivan treated them like a hostile takeover meeting, arms crossed, jaw tight, daring the therapist to break through his defenses. But with Ruby beside him, he couldn't storm out. She didn't let him. Every time his voice rose, she stayed calm. Every time he deflected with sarcasm, she gave him that look, the one that cut straight through his armor. Slowly, painfully, the cracks began to show. One afternoon after the therapist left, Ivan sank into the sofa, exhausted. Ruby handed him a glass of water, and for once he took it without a fight. "You're good at this," he muttered, surprising himself with the words. Ruby raised an eyebrow. "At what, babysitting billionaires?" A smirk tugged at his lips before he could stop it. "At making me face things. No one else has ever managed it." She tilted her head, her tone softer now. "Maybe because no one else cared enough to try." The words landed heavier than she likely intended. Ivan looked at her then, really looked at her, not as the woman who refused to bend under his temper, but as the steady presence who kept showing up, day after day. When she had every reason to walk away, something shifted in that moment. He felt it, though he couldn't name it. The changes were subtle at first. Ivan found himself listening more when she spoke, even outside the sessions. He started asking questions, small ones, almost clumsy, about her siblings, about her childhood, about the scars she carried that had nothing to do with him. And Ruby, guarded as she was, began letting him in, piece by piece. She told him about the nights she'd worked double shifts just to buy school supplies for her brothers, about how she'd promised herself she'd never let anyone make her feel small again. It struck him, the similarity of their vows. Different battles, same armor. One evening, after Ruby laughed at something he said, a real unguarded laugh, Ivan felt an unfamiliar warmth stir in his chest. It unsettled him more than anger ever had, because anger he knew how to wield. But this was dangerous in a different way. He told himself it was nothing, just gratitude, just proximity. But the truth pressed harder with each passing day. Ruby Johnson wasn't just helping him heal. She was changing the way he saw strength, loyalty, even himself. And though he would never admit it aloud, not yet, he realized that for the first time in his life, he didn't dread tomorrow. Because tomorrow meant Ruby would be there. 6 months. That's how long Ruby Johnson had been tethered to Ivan Warren's orbit. Long enough to know his every scowl, his every attempt to mask pain with arrogance. Long enough to recognize when his anger was just fear in disguise. She'd seen him at his lowest, trembling from exhaustion, barely able to grip a glass of water. She'd seen him at his most defiant, sneering through therapy exercises, refusing to give in, even as sweat poured down his face. And to her own surprise, she'd seen him change. It wasn't sudden, but it was undeniable. He listened more now. He apologized, not often, but sometimes in his gruff way. He even laughed, though it was rusty, as if the sound had been buried for years. Ruby told herself it was progress, nothing more. She was proud of his growth, proud of her part in it. But late at night, when she replayed the day, she realized the truth. She wasn't just proud. She was invested. She cared. It hit her one afternoon when he stumbled during a walk in the garden, catching himself with his cane. Her chest tightened, not just with concern for his health, but with something sharper, fear of losing him. That fear startled her. She had always prided herself on keeping her boundaries. She didn't blur lines. She didn't get entangled. But Ivan wasn't like anyone else. He was infuriating, impossible, maddening, and yet he was also vulnerable in ways he didn't let the world see. And she was one of the very few who had earned a glimpse of that man beneath the armor. The realization came quietly, not with fireworks, but with a simple moment. Ivan was struggling through a particularly painful exercise, jaw clenched, sweat dripping down his temple. When he finally finished, he collapsed into the chair, chest heaving, eyes dark with frustration. Ruby handed him a towel, expecting another snide remark. Instead, he whispered, "Don't leave." The words weren't commanding, not barked like an order. They were raw, honest, almost broken. Something inside Ruby shifted. She met his gaze, steady as always, but her heart thudded hard in her chest. For the first time, she allowed herself to admit what she had been denying for weeks. She didn't want to leave. Not anymore. That night, lying awake in her small apartment, Ruby finally put words to the truth. Somewhere between the fights, the silences, and the fragile confessions, she had crossed a line she hadn't meant to cross. She cared for Ivan Warren, not just as a patient, not just as a responsibility, but as a man. And that realization terrified her even more than he ever had. Ruby told herself nothing had changed. She still showed up 3 times a week for therapy, still pushed him when he resisted, still met his temper with steady calm. But the truth lived in the little things. Shifts so small Ivan didn't notice, but Ruby did. When he stumbled, she reached out a second faster than before, her hand lingering just a moment longer on his arm. When he grimaced through a stretch, she placed her palm lightly against his shoulder, grounding him until the tension eased. When he snapped out of frustration, she didn't just roll her eyes. She softened her tone, choosing words that steadied rather than provoked. None of it was conscious at first, but soon she caught herself. The way her gaze lingered when he wasn't looking. The warmth in her chest when he managed something new. The quiet smile she allowed when he laughed, really laughed, not the cutting kind, but the genuine kind she'd begun to coax out of him. One evening, after a session that left him too drained to argue, Ruby found herself brewing tea in his kitchen. He was slouched on the sofa, cane resting against the arm, eyes half closed. She handed him the cup without comment, and for the first time, he didn't question it. He just took it, their fingers brushing, his grip surprisingly gentle. It was nothing, just tea. But Ruby felt her heartbeat catch. She started doing more of those little things, adjusting the pillows before he sat down, bringing books she thought might interest him, making sure his schedule balanced therapy with rest, even if he grumbled. She kept it practical, professional, but beneath it all was something more, a quiet, growing care she couldn't ignore. And though Ivan Warren prided himself on being the sharpest man in every room, he didn't see it. Not yet. To him, Ruby was still the unmovable anchor, the woman who refused to bend. He had no idea that she had already begun to bend in ways she never thought she would. Ruby knew she was walking a dangerous line, but every time Ivan looked at her with that rare, unguarded vulnerability, she told herself the same thing. Just a little longer. He still needs me strong. What she didn't realize was that one day soon, those subtle gestures would be the very cracks that let Ivan see the truth, whether she was ready or not. It happened on a quiet evening after a long therapy session. Ivan had managed to walk the length of the hallway twice without stopping, his cane steady, his breath ragged but controlled. By the time he lowered himself into the chair by the window, his body trembled with exhaustion. Ruby crouched in front of him, adjusting the angle of his cane so it wouldn't slip. Then, without thinking, she reached up and brushed the damp hair back from his forehead. It was a simple gesture, thoughtless, gentle, the kind of thing she'd done 100 times for her younger brothers growing up. But the moment her fingers touched his skin, Ivan stilled. He wasn't used to being touched without demand or expectation. Not as a child, not as a man. Power had always defined his relationships. Handshakes, commands, signatures. Touch had been transactional, strategic, but this was something else. Soft, careful, human. Ruby must have realized it too because she froze, her hand hovering for a beat before she pulled it back. "You're overheated," she said briskly, standing too quickly, reaching for a glass of water as if nothing had happened. But Ivan's eyes followed her, sharp and searching. For the first time, he saw it, the subtle shift he'd been blind to, the way her voice sometimes softened when he fought too hard, the way her gaze lingered longer than necessary, the way she stayed, even when she didn't have to. It unsettled him, because if Ruby Johnson, unyielding, immovable Ruby, cared for him beyond duty, it meant she saw something in him worth caring for. And that was far more terrifying than his stroke, his board, or even the shadow of his father's voice. He didn't mention it, not that night, but as he sat there, water glass in hand, Ivan felt the balance shift inside him. For the first time in his life, power wasn't about dominance. It was about the possibility, dangerous, fragile, undeniable, that he could let someone in, and it scared him more than anything ever had. The thought gnawed at him for days. Ivan Warren, who never second-guessed a decision in business, found himself pacing his study over something as simple and as impossible as dinner. Ruby's touch on his forehead had rattled him. Not the act itself, but the warmth behind it, the care. It had awakened a hunger he couldn't silence, one that had nothing to do with power or control. On the 6th evening, as the last traces of daylight spilled across the garden, he found her organizing his therapy notes at the dining table. He cleared his throat, gripping his cane tighter than necessary. "Ruby," he began, his voice rougher than intended. She looked up, expectant, and for a moment he nearly abandoned the thought. But Ivan Warren didn't retreat. "Not anymore. Join me," he said, gesturing toward the glass doors that opened to the garden. "For dinner, outside." Her brows arched slightly. "Dinner?" "Yes." He forced himself to hold her gaze. "No arguments, no therapy, just dinner." Ruby studied him for a long moment, suspicion flickering across her features. She'd grown accustomed to his demands, his temper, his relentless push for control. This was different. There was no command in his tone, only something quieter, an invitation. Finally, she nodded. "All right. Dinner." That evening, the garden was lit with soft lanterns strung between the hedges. The air carried the faint scent of jasmine, mingling with the warmth of freshly grilled food the house staff had prepared. Ivan sat at the wrought-iron table, Kane propped beside him, watching Ruby take her seat across from him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Ivan allowed the smallest of smiles to tug at his mouth. "Consider this." "A truce," he said. "For one night." Ruby's answering smile was cautious but genuine. And for the first time in years, Ivan felt the world slow around him. The garden glowed softly under the lantern light, shadows dancing across the trimmed hedges and the winding stone path. The food lay untouched between them for several minutes, neither Ivan nor Ruby willing to break the silence first. He wasn't used to this, quiet without hostility. For him, silence had always been a weapon or a threat, but with Ruby it felt different, tentative, alive. Ruby finally set down her glass, leaning back slightly in her chair. "So, why dinner?" "You don't strike me as the candlelight type." Ivan smirked, though the expression was laced with something gentler than his usual bite. "Maybe I wanted to remind myself what it's like to sit across from someone who doesn't cower when I speak." Her lips curved, almost laughing. "You call that charm?" "I call it honesty," he said, meeting her gaze directly. For a moment her eyes held his, steady, unflinching. He should have looked away, but he didn't. Instead, words slipped out before he could stop them. "It's been a long time since I've had anyone sit at a table with me who wasn't there because of money, power." Or fear? Ruby's expression softened and she didn't rush to respond. She just let the admission hang in the warm night air. Finally, she leaned forward, resting her elbows lightly on the table. You ever think maybe that's because you've only let those kinds of people in? Her words weren't cruel, but they pierced him all the same. He looked down at the table, fingers tightening on the stem of his glass. You're not wrong. Ruby tilted her head, studying him. But you're trying now. That's what matters. Something loosened in his chest at her tone. Not pity, not judgment, but quiet belief. And it struck him just how long it had been since anyone had spoken to him like that. I don't know how to be different, he admitted. His voice low, rough. You don't have to know everything tonight, Ruby said. You just have to start. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than any boardroom decree he had ever delivered. Even found himself nodding, almost against his will. And for once, the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was comfortable. As the night wore on, they spoke of small things. Books, her siblings, even the stubborn cat that used to sneak into her family's kitchen back home. Avon listened, really listened, and found himself smiling more than once. When Ruby finally rose to leave, Avon's hand brushed hers across the table. Brief, accidental, but lingering just long enough for both of them to feel it. Neither pulled away immediately. For Ivan Warren, it was the first time in years he hadn't felt alone. 2 weeks after their dinner in the garden, the board convened at Warren Global. Ivan attended, cane in hand, suit pressed sharp as ever. But this time, the fire in his eyes wasn't the same. He listened more than he spoke, let silence linger instead of filling it with thunder. When the vote turned toward his return, the room buzzed with expectation. Ivan Warren reclaiming his throne. That was the story they all wanted. But instead, he leaned forward, his voice measured. I won't be coming back, not yet. Maybe not at all. The board members erupted in confusion, some protesting, others relieved. Ivan raised a hand and the room fell still. I built this empire by crushing everything in my path, people, neighborhoods, even myself. And I nearly died for it. That ends here. Warren Global will move forward without me, because for the first time in my life, I'm stepping back. It wasn't weakness. It was choice. When the meeting ended, Ivan didn't stay to argue. He left them stunned, walked slowly down the corridor, and when the elevator doors closed, he exhaled a breath that felt like it had been trapped in his chest for decades. That evening, he found Ruby in the garden again, sitting on the stone bench where she often read between sessions. Lantern light bathed her in gold, her profile calm against the dusk. He stood there a moment, watching before clearing his throat. She looked up, her expression guarded but warm. I told them today, he said. The board. I'm stepping back, letting go. Ruby blinked, clearly surprised. Ivan, that's huge. He nodded, his cane tapping softly against the path as he moved closer. His eyes locked on hers, steady, unflinching. I'm done chasing ghosts, Ruby. I don't want to waste what time I have left proving myself to men who never cared. His voice dropped lower. I'd rather spend it with someone who does. Ruby's breath caught, her book forgotten in her lap. It wasn't a grand confession. It wasn't flowers or charm. But it was the first deliberate step of a man who had lived his whole life behind walls and was finally ready to let someone inside. Ruby's first instinct was to put up a wall. She had heard confessions before, empty promises from men who thought vulnerability was a currency to buy affection. But as she looked at Ivan Warren, cane in hand, eyes raw with something that looked frighteningly like honesty, she knew this was different. Still, she was cautious. Ivan, words are easy. Change isn't. I know, he admitted, surprising her with the quickness of his reply. But I can't go back to who I was. Not after everything. His gaze didn't falter. Let me prove it. Not to the board, not to the world, to you. Something in her chest stirred at the way he said it. Hope, fragile but undeniable, pressed against her ribs. She gave a small nod. Then start by getting out of this house. Out of your fortress, his brow arched. And go where? A weekend trip, she said simply. Somewhere quiet. No boardrooms. No headlines, just air. To her surprise, He agreed without a fight. The following Saturday, Ruby drove them out of the city to a lakeside inn tucked between rolling hills. The air smelled of pine and water, the kind of clean Ivan hadn't breathed in years. At first he was restless, adjusting to the slower pace, muttering about the lack of cell service. But as the hours slipped by, Ruby saw a change. She found him on the dock at sunset, Kane resting at his side, watching the rippling water with an expression she'd never seen before. Calm, not calculating, not seething, just present. "You look surprised," he said, catching her watching him. "I am," Ruby admitted. "I didn't think I'd ever see you without that scowl." He smirked faintly. "Careful, I might get used to it." They shared a quiet laugh, the sound mingling with the gentle lapping of the waves. For the first time since she had met him, Ruby didn't see the ruthless CEO, the man armored in anger. She saw Ivan, the boy who had been locked in a study, the man learning how to breathe again. And as the lanterns flickered to life along the dock, Ruby allowed herself something she hadn't dared until now. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this broken man could become someone she could love. The weekend passed in a rhythm Ruby hadn't expected. Meals on the inn's patio overlooking the lake, slow walks where Ivan leaned on his cane but kept pace beside her, even quiet afternoons where they simply read in the same room. He was still sharp-tongued, still restless at times, but the edge had dulled. For once, Ivan Warren looked like a man learning to live rather than fight. On their last evening, they returned to the dock. The air was cool, stars scattered like spilled diamonds across the sky. Ruby wrapped her cardigan tighter, and Ivan, without a word, shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She blinked, startled. "You'll catch a cold." "I've survived worse," he said dryly, but there was no arrogance in it, just quiet sincerity. They sat in silence, listening to the water lap against the wood. Ruby glanced at him, the lantern light catching the lines of his face, hard, weathered, but softened in this rare calm. He caught her looking, and for once she didn't glance away. Something passed between them, unspoken but undeniable. "Ruby," he said, his voice low, hesitant in a way she'd never heard before. "You've given me more patience than I ever deserved, more fight than I could match. And for the first time in my life, I don't want to push someone away." Her breath hitched, her heart thudding hard in her chest. She should have answered with caution, reminded him of boundaries, of the risks. But instead she whispered, "Then don't." He reached for her hand, his fingers tentative, almost trembling. Ruby let him, their hands tangling together on the worn wood of the dock. For a long moment they sat like that, the world narrowing to the warmth of his touch, and then Ivan leaned closer, his lips brushing hers with surprising gentleness. Not a conquest, not a demand, just a man asking after a lifetime of taking. Ruby's eyes fluttered shut as she kissed him back, slow, steady, a promise neither of them dared to name yet. When they finally pulled apart, Ivan rested his forehead against hers, his breath uneven. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. Ruby smiled softly. "Good thing I do." And in that quiet, starlit moment, the walls Ivan Warren had spent his life building finally began to crumble. A year had passed since that first kiss on the dock, and Ruby still marveled at the changes she had witnessed in Ivan. The man who once thundered through boardrooms now moved with a different kind of strength. Steady, intentional, no longer ruled by rage. He still had his sharp edges, of course, but they no longer cut indiscriminately. Their weekends together had become routine, sometimes at the lake, sometimes exploring quiet towns where no one recognized his name. Ivan had even grown used to cooking with her, fumbling through recipes he once would have ordered catered. She teased him mercilessly about his terrible knife skills, and he bore it with mock irritation, secretly enjoying the sound of her laughter filling his kitchen. More than once, Ruby caught him watching her in those quiet moments, his gaze softer than she ever imagined Ivan capable of. When she asked what he was staring at, he'd shrug and mutter, "Just making sure you're real." He still struggled. Therapy remained a battle, and the ghosts of his father's voice hadn't vanished completely. But now, when those dark nights came, he didn't pace alone. Ruby was there, a hand on his shoulder, a voice in the quiet reminding him that survival wasn't the same as living. And love, she realized, had crept in quietly, not the kind that exploded in grand gestures, but the kind built in shared mornings, stubborn arguments that ended in laughter, and the weight of his hand finding hers in the dark. One evening, as they sat in the garden where everything had begun, Ivan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. His fingers trembled, not from weakness, but from the enormity of the moment. "I've spent a lifetime building empires," he said, voice unsteady. "But none of it matters if I can't build a life with you." He opened the box, the diamond catching the lantern light. "Ruby Johnson, will you marry me?" Ruby's breath caught. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. The garden, the lanterns, even the night air seemed to wait. Then she smiled, tears glistening, and whispered the only word he needed to hear. Yes. For the first time in his life, Ivan Warren felt truly free. The morning of the wedding dawned clear. The sky, a soft stretch of blue that seemed to bless the day. The ceremony was set in the garden of Ivan's estate, the very place where Ruby had once stood her ground against his rage, and where months later he had asked her to dinner. Lanterns hung from the trellises, white roses lined the stone path, and soft music drifted on the summer air. Ivan stood at the end of that path, cane in hand, not as a crutch, but as a reminder of how far he had come. His suit was perfectly tailored, but his expression was stripped of the cold confidence he once wore like armor. Today, he was not the ruthless CEO, not the feared Warren heir. Today, he was simply a man waiting for the woman who had given him back his life. When Ruby appeared, dressed in a simple but elegant ivory gown, the guests rose. But Ivan only saw her, her steady gaze, her calm smile, the quiet strength that had never wavered. As she walked toward him, memory flickered at the edges of his mind. His father's harsh words, his mother's silence, the boy who had once been locked in a study with nothing but fear for company. But as Ruby's hand slipped into his, those ghosts began to fade. The officiant spoke, but Ivan barely heard the words. His focus was on Ruby, on the way her thumb brushed gently across his knuckles, grounding him. When it was time for vows, he hesitated, throat tight before speaking. "For most of my life, I thought strength meant power, control, fear. But you showed me it's something else entirely. Strength is choosing to heal, even when it hurts. Strength is standing here today, letting go of the man I used to be." His voice caught, but he pressed on. "With you, Ruby, I'm not my father's son. I am myself, and I am yours." Tears shone in Ruby's eyes, though her smile never wavered. Her vows were simpler, but no less profound. "You don't have to fight alone anymore, Ivan. You never did. And now you never will." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, he even kissed her, fiercely, reverently, as if sealing not just a promise, but a rebirth. As the guests erupted in applause, Ivan glanced once toward the horizon. For the first time, the shadow of his father's voice was gone. In its place was silence, peaceful, liberating, and filled with the sound of Ruby's laughter at his side. Ivan Warren was free. 6 years later, the garden looked different now. Where lanterns once hung for a wedding, strings of lights twinkled above a picnic table, scattered with crayons and half-eaten sandwiches. Laughter rang out as 2 small children, one dark-haired, with Ruby's determined gaze, the other fairer, with Ivan's sharp eyes softened by mischief, chased each other across the lawn. Ivan sat on the bench beneath the old oak, cane resting beside him, though he rarely needed it now. His son, Michael, barreled into his lap, giggling breathlessly, while little Clara clung to Ruby's skirts, demanding she join the chase. Ruby shook her head, her smile warm and teasing. "You're the one who taught them to run wild, Ivan." "Teaching them to win," Ivan replied, though his grin betrayed him. He kissed the top of Michael's head, the gesture so natural now that even he sometimes forgot how foreign affection once felt. Ruby crossed the lawn and sat beside him, Clara clambering into her lap. For a moment the world stilled around them. The children's laughter, the late afternoon sun gilding the hedges, the quiet hum of a life they had built together. Ivan reached for Ruby's hand, their fingers intertwining with the same steadiness that had carried them through storms. 6 years, he murmured, almost in disbelief. And look at you, Ruby teased softly. Relaxed, happy, surrounded by chaos you actually enjoy. He chuckled, low and content. Who would have thought? Ruby rested her head on his shoulder. I did. Ivan looked out at their children, their joy so unguarded, so free, and felt something he never thought possible. Peace. The boy who had once been locked away, the man who had ruled by fear, had finally broken the cycle. This, Ruby's hand in his, their children's laughter filling the air, was his true empire. And it was more than enough. The end. Hope you enjoyed this wonderful story by Green Tea Tales. Help support this channel with like, share, comment, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.